I don't care if it's the gate to heaven, Colonel. The HOA bylaws state I get a key to every gate in this community, and you will comply or you will be fined into oblivion. The words hung in the humid afternoon air, thick with entitlement and the faint cloying scent of cheap perfume. I stood there, Colonel John Jack Sterling, on my own property, dressed in nothing more threatening than a faded polo shirt and worn-in jeans, facing a woman who looked like a caricature of suburban tyranny. She was plus-size, squeezed into a pastel pantsuit that strained at the seams, and her face, flushed with exertion and indignation, was framed by a helmet of stiff, blonde sprayed hair. This was Karen, the president of the Eagles Landing Homeowners Association, and she was pointing a trembling, manicured finger at the 12-foot reinforced steel gate at the edge of my property, a clipboard clutched in her other hand like a scepter. I had been a resident for less than a month, and I was already in the crosshairs of a petty dictator. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of her demand was breathtaking. This wasn't a quaint picket fence gate to a rose garden. It was an industrial-grade automated security barrier, and her demand was as ludicrous as asking for the keys to my truck just because it was parked in my driveway. I could feel the familiar calm settling over me, the one that always came in moments of high-pressure absurdity, a gift from 30 years in the Air Force dealing with everything from belligerent foreign generals to catastrophic systems failures. I took a slow breath, letting the anger rise and then dissipate. Reacting would give her power. If you think this is insane, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, or share your own HOA nightmare. You won't believe where this goes. I had bought this specific piece of land for two reasons: peace and proximity. It was a unique 50-acre flag lot, a large secluded rectangle of woods and fields connected to the main road by a long private driveway. The house itself, along with a tidy 1-acre parcel around it, technically fell within the boundaries of the upscale Eagles Landing HOA. The other 49 acres, however, did not. They were unincorporated county land that just happened to border the western perimeter of Northwood Air Force Base, the very base I had recently been assigned to command. This gate, the object of Karen's obsession, was situated on the far boundary line, miles from the manicured lawns of the HOA, and served a single critical purpose. It was a classified, secure emergency access point for the base commander, me. Its existence was authorized at the highest levels of the Department of Defense, a strategic asset allowing me to get from my home to my command center in under 5 minutes in a crisis, bypassing all public roads. It was, for all intents and purposes, a gate to a federal military installation, and she was demanding a key. "Ma'am," I began, my voice deliberately low and even, "I believe there's been a misunderstanding. This portion of the property is not within the jurisdiction of the HOA." I had done my due diligence. I had read every line of the covenants, studied every map in the county plat records. I knew exactly where her power began, and more importantly, where it ended. She scoffed, a short, sharp sound of derision. "The rules apply to everyone, Colonel. No exceptions." She tapped her clipboard. "You have a gate. The HOA requires a key for emergency access. It's that simple. Your refusal is a violation of Bylaw 7, Section C. You have 24 hours to comply, or the fines begin. $500 for the first offense, and they double every week." My eyes narrowed slightly. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a power play. In my career, I'd learned to recognize the tells of someone high on their own authority. She wasn't interested in reason or property lines on a map. She was interested in submission. She saw my rank not as a sign of service, but as a challenge to her own dominion. In her small kingdom of beige houses and pristine lawns, she was the supreme authority, and I was the new vassal who needed to be brought to heel. I gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, not of agreement, but of understanding. The battle lines had just been drawn, and if there was one thing I knew how to do, it was plan a campaign. The first official salvo arrived 2 days later, delivered by a certified mail carrier, a detail I'm sure Karen insisted upon to add a layer of official gravity. It was a crisp, cream-colored envelope with the Eagles Landing HOA logo embossed in gold. Inside, a single sheet of paper informed me in stern, bureaucratic language that I had been fined $500 for violation of bylaw 7, section C, failure to provide emergency access key to a common area boundary. The term common area boundary was particularly amusing, given that the gate was adjacent to a federal military installation and miles from the nearest community pool or tennis court. My wife Sarah held the letter, her brow furrowed with a familiar worry. We had moved a dozen times in our 30 years together, and all she had wanted for this final chapter of my career was a quiet place to plant her garden and not have to pack up boxes every 2 years. "Jack, maybe you should just talk to her again," she suggested, her voice gentle. "She seems unreasonable. I don't want trouble." I took the letter from her hand and placed it on the large oak dining table. I looked at my wife, the woman who had stood by me through deployments, long nights, and the constant stress of command, and I gave her a reassuring smile. "This isn't trouble, sweetheart. This is a procedural engagement," I said, "and it's being initiated by an amateur. We don't react, we act. And first, we plan." That evening, the dining room table transformed into a tactical operations center. I unrolled the certified survey plat of our property, a document as detailed and precise as any battlefield map. Alongside it, I placed the thick binder containing the HOA's covenants, conditions, and restrictions. Sarah brought me a cup of coffee and watched with a mixture of amusement and resignation as I began highlighting text, cross-referencing clauses, and making notes in the margins. The evidence was irrefutable. Our property was, as the realtor had described, a flag lot. The small square of the flag, our house and its immediate yard, was indeed inside the HOA. But the long pole, the 49 acres stretching back to the base, was explicitly outside the platted subdivision of Eagles Landing, Phase 4. The gate in question was located on a boundary line that my property shared with the U.S. government, not with the HOA. Karen's authority ended precisely 1.8 miles east of that gate. Armed with this clarity, I drafted my response. It was not an emotional plea. It was a cold, factual, legal rebuttal. I composed it with the same precision I would use for a formal report to the Joint Chiefs. I cited the specific county plat map number, the book and page of the recorded deed, and the exact language in the HOA's own founding documents that defined their geographical limitations. I attached a notarized copy of the survey with the HOA boundary clearly marked in red. I made it impossible to misunderstand. I sent it via certified mail, return receipt requested, creating an unbroken chain of legal documentation. The ball was back in her court. A week passed. Then the second letter arrived. My carefully constructed legal argument had been utterly ignored. The fine had been doubled to $1,000 for continued non-compliance. But she had added a new, even more audacious charge. Unauthorized structure, industrial-grade fencing and gate, $1,000. There was also a handwritten note at the bottom in a looping, aggressive script. "Your maps are irrelevant. All properties in Eagles Landing are subject to architectural review. Tear it down or comply." A cold smile touched my lips. She was so blinded by her lust for control that she was incapable of processing basic facts. Her arrogance was making her sloppy, but the humor was quickly replaced by a chilling realization. This wasn't just ignorance, it was malicious. She knew she was wrong on a factual level, but she believed her power as HOA president gave her the ability to rewrite reality itself. This was no longer a simple dispute. It was an attack. That weekend, I decided to conduct some on-the-ground reconnaissance. I took a slow walk through the neighborhood, a friendly new resident getting to know the area. I observed. I saw a house with a small, tasteful political sign in the yard and a bright orange violation sticker on the front door. 3 houses down, a much larger, more ostentatious sign for a different candidate stood untouched. I saw a pristine home being cited for a barely visible patch of brown grass near the sidewalk, while the lawn of a home with a prominent local lawyer's name on the mailbox had several large dead spots. The pattern was clear: selective, punitive enforcement. My walk led me past the home of a quiet retiree named George, who was on his hands and knees, meticulously trimming the edges of his flower beds. He looked up, saw me, and gave a nervous, tight-lipped smile before immediately looking back down at his work. He was afraid, and I was beginning to understand why. A few days later, I saw George walking his beagle down the quiet cul-de-sac at the end of my street, far from the prying eyes of his immediate neighbors. I fell into step beside him, keeping my posture relaxed and my tone casual. "Beautiful day," I started. He nodded, eyes fixed on the pavement ahead. I decided on a direct but disarming approach. "I'm the new guy at the end of the long driveway, Jack Sterling." I offered a hand. He shook it hesitantly. "George Miller. Welcome to the neighborhood." His handshake was brief, his grip weak. "Thang," I said, "though my welcome has been a bit eventful. Seems I've already run afoul of your HOA president over my back gate." George stopped walking. He looked left, then right, as if expecting Karen to materialize from the azalea bushes. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The gate? Yeah, I heard. Be careful, Mr. Sterling. That woman? She doesn't lose." It was the opening I needed. I spent the next 10 minutes calmly laying out the facts of my situation. The property lines, the bylaws, her demands. As I spoke, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Not just fear, but a deep, weary resentment. He finally sighed, a sound of long-suffering defeat. "She's been finding me for 15 years, he confessed, the words tumbling out as if a dam had broken. "First, it was the paint on my shutters. It was the original color from the builder, but she said it had faded to an unapproved hue. $500. Then my rose bushes were obstructing the public view by growing 2 inches over the top of the fence line. $1,000 over a summer. Last year, she had a guy come out with a tape measure and fine me because my mailbox was, and I quote, 1¾ of an inch too far from the curb. I'm on a fixed income. I can't afford to fight her, to hire a lawyer, so I pay. Everyone just pays." He told me about the Rodriguez family, a young couple with 2 kids who were in a multi-$1,000 battle over their son's portable basketball hoop, which they dutifully stored in their garage every night. He told me about the Chen family, who had spent a small fortune on a beautiful, custom-built pergola in their backyard, only to be forced to tear it down after Karen's architectural review committee, which consisted of her and one of her cronies, decided they didn't like the aesthetic. The pattern wasn't just selective, it was predatory. She targeted the quiet, the new, the elderly, anyone she perceived as an easy mark. The local lawyers, the businessmen with deep connections in the city. Their properties were immaculate and untouched by violation notices. My mission, which had started as a simple defense of my property, had just fundamentally expanded. This wasn't about a gate anymore. It was about liberating a community from a tyrant. The stakes were raised when a thick packet arrived from a downtown law firm. It was a formal demand letter from the HOA's attorney, a bombastic piece of legal saber rattling threatening a lawsuit, a lien on my property, and even foreclosure if I did not immediately provide the key and pay the now accumulated $2,000 in fines plus legal fees. It was clear the lawyer had simply taken Karen's word for it and hadn't spent 10 seconds looking at a plat map. This was a gift. They had escalated the conflict and put their baseless threats in writing through a legal representative. My next call wasn't to a civilian lawyer. I dialed the head of the JAG office at Northwood Air Force Base. I explained the situation calmly and factually. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Let me get this straight, Colonel." The JAG officer, a sharp major named Evans, said slowly, "A civilian homeowners association president is demanding access to a secure, designated Department of Defense entry point?" "That's the tactical summary, Major," I replied. "They are now threatening foreclosure." I could almost hear the legal gears turning in his head. "Sir, this is unprecedented. Any attempt by her to physically interfere with that gate would be a federal security incident. We need to handle this carefully." He advised me to continue treating it as a civilian property dispute for now, to avoid escalating it to a military versus civilian conflict unless absolutely necessary. "But document everything, sir," he stressed, "and the moment she touches that fence, you call me and you call security forces. We'll be happy to explain federal jurisdiction to her." He also told me he was opening an official file on the matter. The USAF was now quietly watching. That week I invited George, the Rodriguezes, and the Chens to my home. I laid out the survey maps, The pile of violation notices, my correspondence, and the threatening lawyer's letter on my dining room table. For the first time, they saw the full picture. They saw they weren't isolated victims of random cruelty. They were all targets in a systematic campaign. The fear in the room began to slowly burn away, replaced by the cold, hard glint of shared anger. "She's a bully," Mr. Rodriguez said, his fist clenched. "And the only way to deal with a bully is to punch back." A fragile alliance was forged that night around my table. We had a mission. We had a plan. The rebellion had begun. Our small group became a covert cell, the Eagles Landing Concerned Citizens Committee. We operated with the quiet efficiency of a special operations unit. I was the strategist, coordinating our efforts. George, with his 15 years of neighborhood history, became our human intelligence officer, gathering stories and identifying other potential allies. Mr. Rodriguez, a data analyst by trade, was tasked with a deep dive into the one area Karen probably thought was untouchable: the HOA's finances. Mrs. Chen, who had worked as a paralegal before her children were born, took charge of organizing our mountain of documentation into a coherent legal file. Our first official move was a formal request filed by Mr. Rodriguez to inspect the HOA's complete financial records for the past 5 years, as was his right under state law. The reaction was immediate and predictable. Karen, through the HOA's management company, began to stonewall. The records were being prepared for an end-of-year audit, they claimed. Then they were in off-site storage and would take several weeks to retrieve. Then the accountant who held them was on an extended medical leave. Every excuse was a transparent lie, and more importantly, a clear violation of the state statutes governing HOAs, which mandated timely access to records for all homeowners. Each refusal was another brick in the wall of evidence we were building. Mrs. Chen meticulously documented every email and phone call, drafting a formal complaint to the state's Real Estate Commission, the regulatory body that oversaw HOAs. While Karen was busy throwing up bureaucratic smokescreens, I launched my own investigation. My time in Air Force intelligence had made me an expert at navigating the labyrinth of public records. Sitting at my computer, I began to pull on the threads of Karen's little empire. I ran background checks and corporate registration searches on Karen, her fellow board members, and, most importantly, the vendors the HOA had on exclusive contracts. The picture that emerged was as corrupt as it was cliché. The landscaping company, Perfect Green Lawns, LLC, which was notorious for levying hefty fines for minor infractions, was registered to a Mr. David Miller. A quick cross-reference showed David Miller was married to Karen's sister. He was her brother-in-law. The painting contractor, Prestige Exteriors, the only company certified by the Architectural Committee to perform exterior painting, was owned by Karen's cousin. The management company that processed the fines and handled the accounts, taking a percentage of every dollar collected, was run by a woman who, according to social media, was one of Karen's closest friends, with dozens of photos of them on cruises and at wineries together. This wasn't just a homeowners association, it was a sophisticated racketeering operation. The fines weren't about maintaining property values. They were a revenue generation scheme designed to funnel money from the residents into the pockets of her family and friends. The bylaws weren't rules. They were the weapons she used to facilitate the shakedown. My gate wasn't a threat to the community's aesthetics. It was a new, potentially lucrative target she had stumbled upon. I dug deeper, accessing the public archives of the HOA's meeting minutes. The pattern was damning. Major contracts like the $500,000 road resurfacing project from 2 years prior had been awarded without a single competitive bid. The decision was made in a special closed-door board session with the unanimous vote of Karen and her 2 loyal board members, Carol and Bob. I presented my findings to the committee at our next clandestine meeting in my basement. The mood, which had been one of righteous anger, now turned to ice-cold fury. Mr. Rodriguez, the data analyst, stared at the flowchart I had drawn connecting Karen to the web of companies. "It's embezzlement," he said, his voice flat. "She's using the fines to cover the inflated contracts she's giving her family. She's stealing from all of us." The objective was no longer just about stopping harassment or defending my gate. It was about dismantling a criminal enterprise and bringing a thief to justice. Our quiet rebellion had just become a fraud investigation. As our pressure mounted, Karen made her most critical and arrogant error. Feeling the heat from our relentless requests for financial records and the growing whispers in the community, she decided to go on the offensive. An email was sent to every homeowner in Eagles Landing, announcing a special assessment of $300 per household. The reason cited was unexpected and significant legal expenditures incurred while enforcing community bylaws. She was making the entire neighborhood pay for the lawyer she had hired to threaten me. It was a breathtakingly bold move, and it was the greatest gift she could have possibly given us. She had just made my personal problem a financial burden for every single one of her subjects. The fence-sitters and the apathetic were suddenly very interested. Phones started ringing across the subdivision. People who had tolerated her reign for years were now staring at a $300 bill for a fight they had no part in. My committee seized the opportunity. We worked through the night to draft a simple, one-page anonymous newsletter. It laid out the facts in stark, undeniable terms. At the top in bold letters, it read, "Why are you paying $300 for the HOA president's personal vendetta?" Below, we explained that the legal expenditures were the result of the board pursuing a baseless legal claim against a homeowner over private property that was not, and never had been, part of the HOA. We included a simplified, easy-to-read version of my survey map, with the HOA boundary clearly marked in red and an arrow pointing to my gate, far outside the line. We didn't use my name. We simply referred to a homeowner. We ended with a simple question. Ask the board why they are spending your money to fight a losing battle, and then ask yourself who is really benefiting from these contracts. Before dawn, a copy of that newsletter was on every doorstep in Eagles Landing. The community, which had been simmering, now began to boil. Karen's carefully controlled kingdom was erupting in open revolt. With the tide turned, I decided it was time to set the primary trap. I knew Karen. Her ego was now fully engaged. She could not, would not back down. She had to be seen as the winner. So I would let her believe she was winning. I had my lawyer draft a new letter to the HOA's attorney. It was a masterpiece of tactical deception, worded to sound like a white flag of surrender. My client regrets this unfortunate escalation, it read, and in the spirit of de-escalation and finding an amicable solution for the good of the community, he is willing to permit a one-time, pre-scheduled inspection of the gate in question by an official HOA representative. This is offered as a good faith gesture to resolve the architectural compliance concerns. To Karen, this would sound like a complete capitulation. The key was the condition. The representative must, of course, sign a standard liability waiver and access agreement prior to the inspection. This standard agreement was the core of the trap. I had Major Evans from the JAG office personally review my lawyer's draft. It was a beautiful, terrible document, a legal Trojan horse. Buried within its dense, boilerplate heavy paragraphs were 5 critical clauses. First, the signatory would affirm they were acting as an official, authorized agent of the Eagles Landing HOA. Second, they would acknowledge the sole purpose of the inspection was to assess the gate's compliance with HOA architectural guidelines. Third, and this was the dagger, the signatory would explicitly acknowledge that the inspection was taking place on a property parcel located outside the platted jurisdiction of the Eagles Landing HOA, as defined by the county record cited in the agreement. By signing, Karen would be formally admitting my entire legal position was correct from the start. Fourth, a clause stating that the area beyond the gate was private property, not subject to any HOA oversight or right of access. And the fifth, the coup de grace, drafted by Major Evans himself, a clause that served as a formal, documented warning. It stated that the signatory acknowledges awareness that the gate is a designated secure access point for a United States Department of Defense facility, and that any attempt to tamper with, damage, bypass, or force entry through said gate is a federal offense prosecutable under Title 18, Section 1382 of the U.S. Code, carrying a penalty of fines and imprisonment. We sent the letter and the attached agreement. The bait was in the water, a carefully crafted appeal to her vanity, armed with a legal warhead. All we had to do was wait for her pride to take it. The response was shockingly swift. The HOA's lawyer, a man whose professional laziness was about to cost his client dearly, clearly didn't read the agreement. He likely scanned the cover letter, saw the words amicable solution and permitted inspection, and immediately forwarded it to Karen, probably patting himself on the back for securing a win. Karen's monumental ego did the rest. She saw my offer not as a trap, but as the groveling of a defeated foe. The idea of scrutinizing the fine print of a standard waiver would have been beneath her. The very next day, her assistant called my lawyer's office to schedule the surrender. Karen wanted to conduct the inspection personally, and she wanted it on Saturday afternoon, a time of maximum visibility, when the neighborhood would be out and about. She was planning a public victory lap. My lawyer confirmed the date and time and politely reminded her assistant that Ms. Smith would need to present the signed and dated access agreement upon her arrival. "Of course," the assistant chirped. "She'll have all the necessary paperwork." The day of the inspection was glorious, a perfect autumn Saturday with a sky of brilliant, cloudless blue. The stage couldn't have been better set. I had briefed my committee. George, the Rodriguezes, the Chens, and now a dozen other neighbors who had been converted to our cause were all strategically positioned in their yards, casually gardening, washing cars, or playing with their kids, all with a clear line of sight to my service road. I had also made two other, more critical calls. The first was to the county sheriff's non-emergency line. I calmly informed the dispatcher that I had a scheduled meeting with a civilian on my private property who had previously made threats regarding a secure U.S. government access point, and I was requesting a patrol unit be on quiet standby in the vicinity as a precaution. The second call was to my security forces commander at Northwood. "I need two of your sharpest airmen," I said. "Full uniform. I want them positioned on the base side of my western access gate at 1400 hours. Their instructions are simple. Stand at parade rest, look professional, say nothing, and just observe whatever happens on the other side of the fence." At precisely 2 p.m., a golf cart came into view, bouncing down the gravel service road. It was Karen, resplendent in a bright pink blazer, at the wheel. Her two loyal board members, Carol and Bob, sat beside her, looking smug. Karen was beaming, radiating triumph. In her hand, she waved the signed access agreement like a captured battle standard. This was to be her moment of ultimate vindication. I met them at the gate alone, my hands in the pockets of my jeans, projecting an aura of complete calm. "Karen, Carol, Bob, thanks for coming," I said, my voice even. She practically vaulted from the golf cart and thrust the signed document into my chest. "Let's get this over with, Colonel," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "I have a community to run." I took the paper from her. My eyes scanned down to the last page. There it was, Karen Smith. The signature was large, flamboyant, and utterly damning. She had just signed her own legal death warrant. I folded the document with deliberate care and placed it in my back pocket. "All right," I said, my voice betraying no emotion. "Let's begin your inspection." I pulled out my smartphone and hit the video record button, holding it up discreetly. "For the record, this is Karen Smith, president of the Eagles Landing HOA, conducting an inspection on Saturday, October 26th at approximately 2:05 p.m. Her triumphant smile flickered. "What are you doing?" she snapped. "Just ensuring we have an accurate record of this amicable resolution," I replied smoothly. "Now, as per the agreement you signed, you are here to inspect the gate for architectural compliance. Please feel free to conduct your inspection from this side of the property line." She stared at me, then at the massive steel gate, a look of confusion clouding her face. "Don't be ridiculous. Open the gate. I need to inspect the operating mechanism. I need to test the access. I need to be given a key." "I'm afraid that's not possible," I said, still perfectly calm. "That wasn't part of the agreement you signed. In fact, the agreement you signed explicitly acknowledges that this area is outside your jurisdiction and that the area beyond this fence is a secure Department of Defense facility. But please, by all means, inspect the architectural features from here. Is the color to your liking?" Her face began to cycle through shades of pink to a deep, blotchy crimson. "This is a game. You're playing games with me, Colonel." "No games, Karen," I said. "Just adherence to a binding legal agreement." Then with my thumb, I pressed the remote clipped to my belt. With a quiet whir, the 12-foot steel gate began to slide open, and as the gap widened, it revealed what was on the other side. Standing there, silhouetted against the bright afternoon sun, were two United States Air Force Security Forces members, in full uniform, armed, standing at a perfect parade rest. Their expressions were like stone. Beyond them, a military patrol vehicle was visible, parked on the perimeter road of Northwood Air Force Base. Karen froze. Her jaw literally dropped open. Her cronies, Carol and Bob, went white as sheets. The entire silent audience of neighbors watched as the reality of the situation was revealed in one stunning, cinematic moment. The silence that descended was absolute, a pocket of vacuum in the otherwise breezy afternoon. The only sound was the faint electronic hum of the gate motor reaching its stop. Karen's gaze was locked on the two armed airmen, her mind visibly struggling to process the scene. The smug certainty that had animated her just moments before had curdled into a mask of slack-jawed disbelief. What is this?" she finally stammered, the words barely a whisper. The clipboard, her symbol of authority, slipped from her grasp and clattered onto the gravel. "This," I stated, my voice projected with deliberate clarity for the benefit of my phone's microphone and the dozens of watching neighbors, "is the secondary emergency access point for Northwood Air Force Base. You are currently looking at uniformed members of the United States Air Force Security Forces standing on federal property." I let the words hang in the air, each one a hammer blow against the fragile construct of her power. I could see the cascade of horrifying realizations flooding her brain, the warnings, the property maps, the document she had so arrogantly signed without reading. You can't have this here," she protested, her voice weak and cracking. "This is a residential neighborhood." "I can and I do," I countered calmly. "This access point was a condition of my purchase of this land, a purchase reviewed and authorized by the Department of Defense. Land which, as you may recall, you just formally acknowledged is not part of your homeowners association." I reached into my back pocket and slowly withdrew the folded access agreement. I held it up. "In this legally binding document, signed by you in your capacity as president of the Eagles Landing HOA, you have acknowledged several key facts. First, that you are currently standing on private property outside your jurisdiction. Second, that you and your association have no authority whatsoever over this gate. And third," I paused, letting the weight of the moment build, my voice dropping into a tone of grave seriousness. "You acknowledge that you are fully aware that any attempt to force access, tamper with, or damage this gate constitutes a federal crime." Carol, her face a pale shade of green, grabbed Karen's arm. "Karen, let's just go. This was a mistake. Let's go." But Karen's ego, cornered and mortally wounded, was incapable of retreat. It lashed out. "You tricked me," she shrieked, her voice rising to a hysterical pitch. "This is illegal. It's entrapment." "Is it entrapment to provide you with a written document and expect you to read it before signing?" I asked, my tone one of genuine curiosity. "I gave you an out, Karen, a clear, documented legal path to de-escalation. You chose this path. You chose to make it a public spectacle. You wanted an audience." I gestured broadly at the surrounding homes, where neighbors were now openly standing on their lawns, phones raised, recording the entire debacle. Bob, the other board member, looked as if he might faint. "Karen, he's right," he pleaded. The lawyer should have read it. We need to leave. Right now." Karen whirled on him, her face contorted with rage. "Shut up, Bob. He's bluffing. He wouldn't dare." She turned back to me, a desperate last-ditch effort to reassert her dominance. "You will be hearing from our lawyer. I am still fining you. This gate is an unapproved structure and it will come down." I almost laughed out loud. The sheer, magnificent delusion was stunning. Fine me for what exactly? A gate that you just legally acknowledged isn't on property you govern? Please, go ahead. Send the letter. Every baseless fine you issue from this moment forward will be submitted as Exhibit A in a lawsuit for malicious prosecution and targeted harassment. I took a deliberate step toward her, closing the distance. "You have been terrorizing people in this community for years, Karen. Shaking them down with petty fines, running this HOA like your personal ATM, lining the pockets of your family and friends. It's over. It stops today." Her eyes widened in genuine shock. You don't know anything about that, she breathed. I know about the inflated landscaping contract awarded without a bid to your brother-in-law, I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper, but each word sharp and clear. I know about the exclusive painting contract with your cousin. I know about the financial records you are illegally withholding from Mr. Rodriguez, a violation of state law. And I know you've been paying yourself a consulting fee from the reserve funds. Each statement landed like a physical blow. The last of her bluster and righteous fury deflated, leaving behind a flustered, terrified woman, utterly exposed in front of the very people she had lorded over. That's slander, she sputtered, but the words had no conviction. Is it? I countered. The annual HOA meeting is in 2 weeks. I suggest you come prepared with answers. Because my friends, I gestured to the Rodriguez and Chen families, who had timed their approach perfectly and now stood shoulder to shoulder with me. And I have a lot of questions. And by the way, we've already filed a formal complaint with the state. A full forensic audit of your books is coming, Karen. The word audit was the kill shot. It struck her with the force of a physical impact. She visibly slumped, her mouth opening and closing with no sound coming out. She knew in that instant that the game was truly and finally over. I raised the remote and pressed the button. The steel gate began its smooth, silent journey, closing the scene and hiding the impassive airman from view. The show was over. In the sudden quiet, I looked at her and her 2 terrified cronies standing on my property. Now, I said, my voice flat and cold, if your architectural inspection is complete, I believe you are trespassing. Without another word, Carol scrambled into the driver's seat of the golf cart and fumbled with the key. Karen, looking dazed and shrunken, collapsed into the passenger seat. They sped away in a cloud of dust and shame, a hurried, pathetic retreat. And then, a sound I hadn't expected. A smattering of applause broke out from the neighboring lawns, growing as others joined in. It wasn't a roar, but it was the unmistakable sound of liberation. The video of Karen's spectacular public implosion, captured from no fewer than 3 different angles by my newly emboldened neighbors, went viral within the confines of Eagle's Landing. It was forwarded, texted, and talked about with the kind of breathless excitement usually reserved for a major scandal. The myth of Karen the Invincible, the unassailable monarch of the cul-de-sac, was not just broken, it was obliterated. The fear she had so carefully cultivated over the years had been replaced by a potent cocktail of ridicule and long-suppressed rage. Her authority, which had always been a fragile illusion held together by bluff and the apathy of her subjects, had vanished in the space of a 10-minute video. The aftermath was a study in contrast. For Karen, it was the beginning of a chaotic, frantic spiral. For our committee, it was a moment of profound and calm satisfaction. My phone became a constant buzz of activity. Text messages poured in from neighbors I'd never met, offering support, sharing their own horror stories of her reign, and asking how they could join the fight. Our covert committee of 4 had overnight become the de facto leadership of a full-blown homeowners rebellion. The HOA's lawyer, having presumably received a hysterical phone call from his client, contacted my attorney the following Monday morning. The conversation, as my lawyer gleefully recounted to me, was brief and stripped of all its former arrogance. The lawyer's tone had shifted from that of a predator to that of a cornered animal. He made a feeble attempt at damage control, claiming his client had been misled and that the signed agreement was invalid. My lawyer simply posed a single, devastating question. As her legal counsel, did you or did you not review the access agreement before advising your client to sign it? The long, damning silence on the other end of the line was all the answer needed. My lawyer then calmly informed him that we would be proceeding with a civil suit against the HOA for harassment and malicious prosecution. We would be seeking damages for the frivolous fines, the illegally levied special assessment, and all associated legal fees. Furthermore, he stated our intention to file a petition for the immediate removal of the entire board for gross negligence and multiple breaches of their fiduciary duty to the community. The opposing counsel could only muster a weak, "We will take that under advisement," the universal legal code for "we are in very deep trouble." Events then began to accelerate. A few days later, a formal letter arrived from the state's real estate commission. Our complaint, bolstered by the evidence of financial obstruction and the signed confession from Karen, had been fast-tracked. They were opening a full investigation and, more importantly, ordering an independent forensic audit of the Eagles Landing HOA's finances going back 5 full years. The news spread through the neighborhood like a shockwave. Simultaneously, Karen's two cronies, Carol and Bob, made a desperate play for self-preservation. A community-wide email went out announcing their immediate and unequivocal resignations from the board. In a masterclass of backpedaling, they claimed they were previously unaware of the full scope of the legal and financial irregularities and wanted to apologize for any distress caused. They threw Karen under the bus so hard it left tire tracks. This left Karen utterly alone, the sole remaining member of the board, a captain without a crew on a ship that was not only sinking, but also actively on fire, with state auditors climbing aboard. The HOA's management company, smelling the smoke and seeing the flames, promptly sent a letter terminating their contract, citing the board's failure to operate in good faith and within the bounds of state law. They were cutting their losses and running for the hills. But I wasn't finished. That signed document was a gift that kept on giving. My lawyer drafted one final demand letter, this one addressed not to the HOA, but to Karen Smith personally. He argued that because she had signed the document as an agent of the HOA while knowingly acting outside its jurisdiction for a personal vendetta, she had effectively pierced the corporate veil, the legal shield that normally protects board members from personal liability. We demanded that she, Karen Smith, personally reimburse every single homeowner for the $300 special assessment. We also demanded that she personally pay my legal fees in their entirety. The fight was no longer about her title or her power. It was now about her house, her savings, her personal financial future. The consequences of her hubris were no longer abstract. They were coming for her bank account. The annual HOA meeting, which had been scheduled weeks before Karen's world came crashing down, was transformed from a mundane procedural gathering into the most anticipated event in the community's history. The community center clubhouse, a room that typically held a dozen or so board residents for the yearly budget review, was packed to the gills. People were standing along the walls, spilling out into the hallway. I counted over 200 homeowners, a crowd animated by a palpable, electric sense of anticipation. Our committee had prepared. We had a laptop, a projector, and a microphone ready to go. Karen, as the sole remaining board member, was legally obligated to chair the meeting. She arrived late, looking like a ghost. The imperial posture was gone, replaced by a defeated slump. Her hair was disheveled, her face was pale and puffy, and she steadfastly refused to make eye contact with the sea of hostile faces staring back at her. She tried to race through the opening formalities, the call to order, the approval of last year's minutes, her voice a shaky monotone. But the moment she nervously asked if there was any new business, I rose from my seat in the front row. "I have a motion," I announced, my voice calm but carrying easily through the silent, cavernous room. "I move for a vote of no confidence in the immediate removal of Karen Smith as president and as a member of the board of directors, on the grounds of gross negligence, malfeasance, and breach of fiduciary duty." Mrs. Chen, sitting beside me, immediately stood. "I second the motion." Before Karen could even process what was happening, before she could attempt to rule it out of order, the room erupted in a thunderous chorus of "Aye!" It wasn't just a vote. It was a roar of catharsis, years of pent-up frustration and anger unleashed in a single unified sound. Karen, flustered, stammered something about procedure and bylaws. But Mrs. Chen was already at the microphone. She calmly read aloud the specific article and section of the HOA's own governing documents that detailed the process for the removal of a board member by a simple majority vote of the homeowners present at a scheduled meeting. Karen had been checkmated with her own rule book. A formal paper ballot was quickly conducted. The result was a landslide, 214-1. The one dissenting vote, we all assumed, was her own. In a stunning public humiliation, Karen was stripped of her title, her power, and her position. She was no longer President Smith. She was just a resident, and the most despised one in the neighborhood. As she began to shakily gather her papers, preparing to make a hasty exit, A man in a crisp gray suit whom nobody recognized walked to the front of the room. He adjusted the microphone. "Excuse me," he said, his voice the epitome of professional calm. "My name is David Miles. I am the lead forensic auditor appointed by the state's Real Estate Commission. Our preliminary audit of the association's finances is complete, and I believe this community has a right to hear our initial findings." A deep hush fell over the room. Karen, who had her back to the crowd, froze mid-step. The auditor clicked a button on the laptop, and a simple spreadsheet filled the projector screen. The numbers, even at a glance, were shocking. He began to walk the assembled homeowners through 5 years of systematic, deliberate fraud. The no-bid landscaping contract with her brother-in-law's company was inflated by 40% over standard market rates, a discrepancy that had cost the homeowners over $200,000. The exclusive painting contract with her cousin showed similar, egregious markups. But the true bombshell was a line item labeled strategic consulting fees, a monthly payment of $2,500 made to a shell corporation named KS Enterprises. The auditor had easily pierced the corporate veil. KS Enterprises was registered to a post office box under Karen's maiden name. For 5 years, she had been methodically embezzling from the community's reserve funds, paying herself a secret salary of $30,000 a year. The petty fines, the special assessments, it was all to cover the money she was stealing. The room was utterly silent, a tableau of open-mouthed shock. People looked from the damning numbers on the screen to Karen's rigid back, the gears of understanding and betrayal turning in their minds. Mr. Rodriguez, sitting next to me, just slowly shook his head, a grim smile of vindication on his face. The data had told the truth. "Our findings, which include clear evidence of embezzlement and wire fraud," the auditor concluded, "have been forwarded to the district attorney's office. I would expect criminal charges to be filed shortly." At the mention of criminal charges, 2 uniformed sheriff's deputies, who had been standing discreetly at the rear of the room, began to walk slowly and deliberately down the center aisle. Their presence suddenly made sense. They weren't here for crowd control. They were here for her. Karen finally turned, her face a crumpled mask of tear-streaked disbelief as she saw them approaching. "No," she whispered, a pathetic, hopeless sound. "You can't." One of the deputies addressed her, his voice devoid of malice but firm with authority. "Karen Smith, you are under arrest on suspicion of embezzlement and felony fraud." He gently took her arm and cuffed her hands behind her back. The sharp, metallic click of the handcuffs echoed in the dead silent room. They led her away past the rows of neighbors she had bullied, intimidated, and systematically robbed for years. Her public downfall was now complete, a symbolic and fitting end to her reign of terror. The Queen was being led away in chains from her own throne room. The image of Karen being escorted from the community center in handcuffs became the final, defining moment of her legacy in Eagle's Landing. It was a walk of shame that was less a spectacle of victory for us and more a moment of profound and necessary closure for the entire neighborhood. The whispers that followed her out the door were not cruel or celebratory. They were the collective sound of a community exhaling, releasing a tension that had been building for the better part of a decade. The tyrant was gone, and the very air in the room felt cleaner, lighter. In the weeks and months that followed, the community began the slow, deliberate process of rebuilding. But it was a task we undertook with a remarkable and newfound sense of unity. That very same night, after the deputies had departed with their prisoner, we held an impromptu election. George, the gentle retiree whom Karen had relentlessly bullied over his mailbox and rose bushes, was unanimously elected as the new HOA president. Mr. Rodriguez, the man who had demanded to see the numbers, naturally became our new treasurer. Mrs. Chen, our meticulous paralegal, became the secretary. The very people Karen had tried to crush were now in charge, a perfect, ironic testament to the failure of her oppressive regime. The new board's first order of business was a systematic campaign to undo Karen's toxic legacy. They immediately terminated the fraudulent contracts with her family's businesses and hired a reputable, independent law firm to aggressively pursue a civil suit against Karen and her shell corporation, with the goal of clawing back every stolen dollar. They spent weeks poring over old records, identifying and formally voiding years of unjust fines. Letters of apology, accompanied by reimbursement checks, were sent to dozens of families. The illegal special assessment was, of course, the first thing to be refunded in full. The Rodriguez family's basketball hoop went back up, a small but powerful symbol of the new era. The Chens were given not only a formal apology, but also a grant from the HOA's Recovering Reserve Fund to rebuild their pergola, with a note from George saying, "Build it twice as beautiful this time." My own role, my mission having been accomplished, receded back into the quiet life of a regular neighbor. I had no interest in a board position. My victory was complete in seeing George, a man once afraid to speak, now confidently and fairly chairing meetings. It was in seeing neighbors who once scurried past each other with downcast eyes, now gathering for potlucks and organizing a real neighborhood watch program, one based on community, not suspicion. The legal system, in its slow, grinding way, delivered the final chapter. Faced with an insurmountable mountain of evidence from the forensic audit, Karen pleaded guilty to multiple felony counts of embezzlement and fraud. The personal fallout was catastrophic for her. Her husband, humiliated and financially ruined, filed for divorce. They were forced to sell their large, immaculate house in Eagles Landing to cover her legal fees and the massive restitution ordered by the court. The successful civil suit from the HOA stripped them of any remaining assets. In the end, she lost everything: her money, her reputation, her family, and her freedom. A judge sentenced her to 4 years in a state penitentiary. When the news came, there was no celebration, only a quiet, somber sense of an ordeal finally being over. Her downfall was a textbook case of self-destruction, a story of how unchecked arrogance and a thirst for petty power can lead to absolute ruin. Life on my 50 acres returned to the tranquil existence I had sought from the very beginning. The gate, the inanimate object that had unwittingly started a revolution, now stood as a silent monument to the principle we had fought for. It was never about the steel or the motor. It was about the simple, powerful idea that no one is above the law, not even a power-crazed HOA president. Sometimes in the quiet of the evening, Sarah and I would sit on our back porch, looking out across the dark fields toward the unassuming gate, and we would just shake our heads and marvel at the sheer absurdity of it all. The president of the Eagles Landing Homeowners Association had, in all her hubris, demanded the keys to a secure Department of Defense facility. In doing so, she had single-handedly triggered her own spectacular downfall and, in the process, liberated an entire community. It was a reminder that while the arc of the moral universe is long, sometimes with a sound strategy, meticulous documentation, and a few brave allies, you can give it a firm, decisive bend toward justice. The neighborhood was finally at peace, a true Eagle's Landing, governed not by fear, but by the simple, decent principles of community and respect. And that was a victory far greater and more lasting than simply winning a fight over a gate.